This is a bit of a celebration for me today. It's my first time indoors for a worship service in 16 months. Thanks be to God for vaccines. Yes. I'm very honored to have been invited to be with you here today while Pastors Jolene and Brian are on sabbatical. We hope they're having a meaningful time of renewal. What an experience this last 16 months has been, and it isn't over. Churches, families, and communities will be challenged for a long time to help people come to terms with the challenges and losses, and especially intense suffering as they have cried out to the Lord. I wonder, might we not have a sense of that too from the past year? Oops, sorry, page mix up there. Especially where there has been death and disability, job loss, isolation, and interruptions in schooling. Those are some of the things we've gone through. My husband and I had our first grandchild born in the midst of this last year and had the loss of not really being able to interact with him in person until just a couple of months ago. But I know every family has things, little and big, that have been forced upon you to which you are coming to terms. And as the tide may be turning here in the US right now, I'm curious, what will we take from this pandemic experience? In addition to formerly being a pastor, I am also a spiritual director. I meet with people, directees, about once a month to have a conversation about how they are connecting to God in their lives. It's a holy opportunity to be invited into people's spiritual journeys in this way. Fortunately, since we've all had a crash course in how to do Zoom this past year, hi people on Zoom, the pandemic didn't interrupt being able to meet with my directees. As I have continued to spiritually listen with people throughout this time of pandemic, I'm reflecting on what spiritual insights there might be for us in this. Are there any learnings? Are there ways, as the psalmist says, our souls have been strengthened? Psalm 138 was just by random one of the lectionary texts today. The commentaries say that the psalm is a psalm of confession and testimony of praise after some sort of disaster. Now that's confession in the sense of we confess to how great God is more than we're confessing how wrong we are. Confession, there was some sort of a strong traumatic experience from which these people were delivered. Other psalms of this type refer to that as a day of disaster or a day of trouble. We don't know specifically what it was but there was some sort of intense suffering where people were crying out to the Lord. And I wonder, might we not have some sense of that too after this past year? Now we see in this psalm that the psalmist takes both a macro, whole universe look and an up close and personal view of their experience. In verse 1, they zoom way out to the whole cosmos to give praise before the gods. Before the gods, I sing your praise. The word in the original language for the gods in Hebrew suggests this whole cosmos reality. The psalmist exalts God's name and word above everything. And in verse 4 and 5, that macro view is heard again when they describe all the kings of the earth shall praise you, for great is the glory of the Lord. There's this big view. The psalmist is so full of praise They believe God's deliverance is known through the entire cosmos. That big view is paired, however, with the utterly personal.
Right.
It's a testimony of personal deliverance and thanksgiving. Verse 3, on that day you answered me and increased the strength of my soul. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve me. Your right hand delivers me. The psalmist gets very personal. They knew God to answer when they called. They feel now they were kept safe in a time of trouble, and they see that as God's hand of protection. God came through, and God brought them through their time of disaster. The psalmist looks back on the experience and sees it as a time where God saved. It was disaster. Now it's salvation. We also notice that the psalmist makes a point of proclaiming what they have learned about the character of God. That God was steadfast, that God was faithful, that God's name is worthy of glory. And verse 8, I love verse 8. The future will be love-drenched. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. That is such a powerful confession and testimony that the disaster from which this writer was saved is not enough to rob them of the faith that our future with God is full of love. As I reflect on this psalmist's confession and testimony, I wonder how this mirrors our own experiences in this time of pandemic. How has what we've been brought through been like a biblical day of disaster? It's interesting. Our day of disaster has been something of both a macro and micro levels of experience. Across the world it has traveled, and it's been in our own homes. What might be our expressions of thanksgiving, gratitude, and faith coming out of this year? To what might we testify about God? In the midst of pondering those questions and this psalm, it was verse 3 that especially stands out to me. On the day I called, you answered me. You increased my strength of soul. Doesn't that sound like a powerful testimony? Is that something we can confess and testify to as well? How might our souls have been strengthened during this time of pandemic? I'd like to think together a little bit about that now. One of the things I have noticed that I hope has been soul strengthening in our time of pandemic is the ways we have been able to take time to take advantage of the gift of nature. In the Celtic tradition, nature is considered the first book of revelation. In other words, before the scriptures were given in written form, God's glory and presence were known throughout the created world, and God could be seen in nature. I've also been learning about a 12th century German abbess, Hildegard de Bingen, who writes about a spiritual insight she has called the greening power of God. She had a strong sense of God's presence in all of nature and saw the divine photosynthesis that grows everything by transforming light into itself. That takes us back to high school biology, doesn't it? The light being turned into living material. Hildegard understood that as a core spiritual reality. She had a name for it, Veriditas, the greening of all things. And she prescribed time in nature as part of a healing process for the people she cared for. Intentional time in nature is one way I think God is strengthening our souls in a time of pandemic. A second thing I've been thinking about as soul strengthening is how we pay attention to time. There's a wonderful new book by Christine Walters Paintner called Sacred Time: Embracing an Intentional Way of Life, that looks at how we view time as a portal to the divine, a portal to the divine. In it, she talks about how we experience time as both horizontal, past, present, future, but also as vertical, as a threshold to the experience of God. Horizontal time is measured by clocks and calendars. The Greeks called it chronos. It has a sense of direction from then to now to yet to come. But there's another sense of time that is referred to in the Bible, kairos, which means appointed or opportune time. We're in kairos time, and think about this with me now. When there are moments of awe and wonder, creating, dreaming, meditating, or rituals like communion and celebration. It's not linear. And when we're in kairos time, we lose track of time. The clock doesn't stop, but we don't hear the ticking. It's time that has a vertical direction because it opens us to the divine. In the Celtic tradition, they also had a way of thinking about time as a spiral or a wheel, as coming round and round and then beginning again. Many indigenous traditions have this wisdom as well. We'd be most familiar with the circular or spiral sense of time when we think about our seasons, spring turning into summer, into fall, and winter, and coming round again. Paintner talks about that fourfold rhythm in thinking about the flow of time in other ways as well. We have the seasons, but you can also think about it as a day. Dawn, day, dusk, dark. Or the cycle of the lunar moon. Growing, full, waning, dark. Again, with the seasons, it might be blossoming, fruiting, releasing, resting. And our Hebrew Christian tradition has paid attention to that circular type of time and has synced its festivals and holy celebrations with the seasons. So you end up having Lent and Easter in spring, and in summer, Pentecost and Transfiguration. In autumn, there's All Souls and All Saints. And in the winter, Christmas and Epiphany. These kinds of patterns can help us connect to God. They create ways for us to take holy pauses and connect with the cycles of the natural world and with our communities and with God. Because for many of us, the pandemic forced us to alter our relationship with time. You know, some days we kind of got mixed up what day it even was. Perhaps we became more alert to one or more of these fourfold rhythms. Maybe we happened to discover a little something about the blessings of Kairos time. Today you received as a handout this page that takes our day and breaks it into 4 brief pauses for prayer: daybreak, midday, dusk, and dark. And I invite you to try that this week. Perhaps step outside on your porch or go to a favorite tree and face one of the 4 directions these are hinge points in the day that we can pause, and there is a snippet of scripture prayer for each of those 4 pause points. Perhaps this will be a moment for you to rest in God and strengthen your soul in the days this week. A third practice for strengthening the soul that I learned about during the pandemic has to do with breathing. And I think this is really poignant because COVID has been a disease that damages the ability to do good breathing. Those who have suffered from COVID know that the ability to take a full, good breath was very difficult. We've never had to be more aware, have we, of the air that we share, since danger was literally circulating. Breath connects us to a holiness at the center of life. Our breath is our life from God. It's the first primal organic connection we have to the Creator who breathed life into us. It's said that a person will take 700 or 800 million breaths in a lifetime. And when we no longer breathe, we no longer have life in this earthly realm. The Jewish word for God, what we say, Yahweh, is actually a word without vowels. And it isn't said as much as it is breathed. The very name for God in the faith tradition of our forebears is carried only on the breath. Breathing then is something of a threshold, a gateway from and to eternity. We took our first breaths when we were born, and we will take our final breaths when we die. Each breath we have touches us to the source of life. A spiritual director friend of mine from Australia, Dr. Sally Longley, will be introducing in our spiritual practice time a breath practice that she wants to offer us that is a way to combine a moment of meditation with the breath. Sally is a spiritual director, as I said, in Sydney, and she and her husband also attended Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary for a few years back when I was also a student there. And I think this is a practice that we will find helpful to include in our lives. We have not come through the past year what the Psalms call a day of disaster unscathed. We know there have been tremendous losses in many families and communities across the globe. And this disaster isn't yet finished for many. Still, it has been helpful for me at this point to reflect on this pandemic experience through the lens of Psalm 138. To see where God is at work in the big picture and in the up close and personal. To consider to what we might confess and testify about what God has done. To where we are seeing God's presence and right hand at work. To ponder how we can, or perhaps be able to testify to God's steadfast faithfulness and love, and to the glory of God's name. And to imagine, like the psalmist, faith in a love-drenched future. As we look to the months ahead, I hope we can see with eyes of faith that God is at work fulfilling God's purposes, and that God's steadfast love endures forever, even up to and beyond our final breaths. How have your souls perhaps been strengthened? What might we take up as practices to help God's soul strengthening happen within us? How might we allow time in nature and a slower experience of time and breathing prayer to be God's strengthening of our souls? And looking forward, like the psalmist, are we putting our hopes and faith in a love-drenched future with God's hand to guide and hold us? Here is one of my very favorite ways of indulging in faith in a love-drenched future. This is our grandson, Finn, now almost 11 months old. It's so wonderful to finally be getting to know this little guy up close and in person. It's something I won't ever take for granted. These have been some of the reflections I have had from the wisdom of Psalm 138. It's such a joy to be able to be with you today. I pray for the strengthening of your souls now and in the days to come. Amen.